before recessing for their party lunches. Members will return at 2:15 and begin debate on the nomination of Leon Panetta to be the next Defense Secretary. A final vote on that is set for 4th day. And now live coverage of the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. You come to us, O Lord. Into our poverty comes your wealth. Into our emptiness comes your fullness. Into our fears comes your peace. Into our ugliness comes your beauty. Empower our senators to prepare themselves for your coming. Remove any barrier that will keep them from experiencing your presence. Lord, give them more than human wisdom so that justice, truth, and peace will prevail. Come to us, O Lord, and make us instruments of your peace. We pray in your great name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., June 21, 2011. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint Honorable Michael F. Bennett, a senator from the state of Colorado, to perform the duties of the chair, signed Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President,
The Majority Leader.
I would note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
The Majority Leader.
Unanimous consent the call of quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, following any leader remarks, the Senate will be in morning business till 11 a.m. today. Republicans will control the first half, majority controlling the final half. I would ask at this time, Mr. President, that the morning business hour be a full hour, not stop at 11 o'clock.
Without objection.
The filing deadline for second-degree amendments is 2S782. The EDA bill is at 11 a.m. this morning. Following morning business, Senate will be in executive session to consider the nomination of Michael Simon to be a United States District Judge in Oregon. At noon, there will be a vote on confirmation of the Simon nomination. Following that vote, the Senate will recess to 2:15 p.m. today for the weekly caucus meetings. At 2:15, the Senate will consider the nomination of Leon Panetta to be Secretary of Defense with 2 hours for debate. At about 4:15 then this afternoon, senators should expect up to 3 roll call votes. The first on confirmation of the Panetta nomination. The second will be cloture vote on the EDA bill. And if cloture is not invoked, there will be a third vote on cloture on the motion to proceed to the Presidential Appointment Efficiency and Streamlining Act. I might note that this or some version of this is, we've been talking about this for a long time. When Senator McConnell and I were both whips, we talked about this legislation and spent a lot of time on it. Mr. President, this afternoon we'll have a cloture vote on reauthorization of the Economic Development Administration, a law we've depended on for more than 50 years. This is the 4th jobs bill Democrats have brought to the floor this year. I do hope Republicans will not allow it to be the 4th jobs bill to wither on the vine, thanks to their obstructionist tactics. This is a good piece of legislation with decades of helping American businesses and economically distressed communities to innovate, grow, and to hire. In the last 5 years alone, the Economic Development Administration has created 314,000 jobs. It has successfully turned every $1 in federal investment into $7 in private sector investment. It's good legislation that will create good jobs for Americans who need these jobs. Unfortunately, that's not enough to win bipartisan support among the Republicans here in the District of Columbia now, who are more interested in destroying Medicare than creating jobs. The Small Business Innovation Research Bill was a good piece of legislation, too. That also died in the Senate last month under a pile of unrelated amendments. The bills the Senate passed this year reauthorizing the Federal Aviation Administration and reforming America's patent system were good legislation also. They would have created or saved about 480,000 jobs that made it out of the Senate alive. But now they're languishing in the Republican-controlled House. Mr. President, will the Economic Development Authority suffer the same fate? I hope not. Here, 24 hours ago, I presented to the American people and to the Senate the myriad of amendments that have been filed in regard to this legislation. A lot of them have been offered, but filed. I read about 40 of them, dealing with different types of endangered species. The lesser sand dune reptile, or I don't remember what it was, but all kinds of non-related amendments. Global warming, post office reform. As I said, Mr. President, almost 100 amendments, and I read 35 or 40 of them here yesterday, having nothing to do with this legislation, nothing. So I hope we don't have another bill that's blocked, the 4th this year. If they do that, it would be clear they're more interested in this right-wing ideology than creating much-needed employment. None of the 90-plus amendments, I repeat, only one of which my staff was able to find had any germaneness to the bill, and that's one that the chairman of the committee, Senator Boxer, would agree to anyway, because it was offered by Senator Inhofe. This is an important piece of legislation. This legislation will put hundreds of thousands of people to work. So today's vote is again about priorities. Americans have been very clear. Job creation is their #1 priority, their #2 priority, their #3 priority. Democrats share that priority. Republicans obviously don't. We'll never stop bringing jobs bills to the floor. and we'll never stop fighting the other side's obstructionism to try to get them passed. Again, Republicans have a different priority, it appears, and that's ending Medicare, and that's too bad. They've worked hard to block 3 bills that could have created and saved hundreds of thousands of jobs during tough economic times. But they pushed even harder for the ideological plan to kill Medicare as we know it. The Republican plan would put insurance company bureaucrats between seniors and their doctors. Every senior would pay $6,400 more for health care in the first year alone. And it would force more than 7 million seniors to pay more for cancer screenings, wellness checks, and treatments at the beginning of the year. Americans have been clear about this. They've been very clear. They've resoundingly rejected this ideological plan to hurt seniors. Republicans think it's a bad idea. Democrats think it's a bad idea. And, of course, the independents think it's a bad idea. And this is, all polls show this. Unfortunately, I haven't heard a shred of evidence that my Republican friends here in Congress are getting the message on Medicare that the American people have gotten weeks ago. Today, they'll have a chance to show the American people, once again, whether they heard the message on jobs. I hope they have, because so much is at stake, and America's watching.
Mr. President. The Republican leader.
Yesterday, I came to the floor to report that there were several miners in my state trapped in a mine as a result of floods. I want to start today with an update on that situation. I'm happy to report that all 3 were rescued after spending 14 hours trapped in a Bell County coal mine. They were all reunited with their families last night, which is great news. Their families were waiting for them at the West Cumberland Baptist Church, and we're certainly glad that this particular story had a happy ending. On another matter, this morning I'd like to say a word about the upcoming vote on the debt ceiling and the bipartisan negotiations surrounding it, to reiterate why we're having these talks and what they ought to achieve. But first, a little context. Right now, ratings agencies are threatening to downgrade U.S. debt, putting us on red alert that the kind of economic crisis we're seeing in parts of Europe could very quickly happen right here. We know that failing to do something significant about our fiscal problems would be a serious drag on jobs and our economy. And that's why over the past several weeks I've come to the floor of the Senate and spoken up at press conferences with a now familiar refrain: the time to act on significant reforms is right now. And I've been crystal clear about what qualifies as significant. Above all, it means doing something to strengthen and preserve our long-term entitlement programs so that we can actually keep our promises to those who've been paying into these programs for years. And so these programs don't end up consuming every single dollar we take in. Entitlements are the biggest drivers of our debt. By definition, they have to be a part of any plan to lower the debt. This is hardly a controversial view. Everyone from the President on down has said that entitlements must be reformed if we have any chance at all of reining in our debt and strengthening our long-term fiscal health. In fact, 3 months ago, 31 Senate Democrats signed a letter to the President urging him to put together a plan to reduce the deficit, a plan they said they hoped would include entitlement changes. 31 members of the Democratic Conference right here on the other side of the aisle, including the occupant of the chair. As the occupant of the chair put it recently, I think it's absolutely clear that we have to redesign our entitlement programs. Here's how Senator Durbin put it a few weeks ago. We have serious economic problems ahead of us if we don't have some reform in both Medicare and Social Security. This was from former President Bill Clinton after a recent congressional election in New York. Quote, "I don't think the Democrats or the Republicans should conclude from the New York race that no changes can be made in Medicare." That's President Clinton. Or that no changes can be made in Social Security. That's President Clinton. That no changes can be made that will deal with this long-term debt problem. Here's President Obama's lead negotiator on the debt talks, Vice President Biden, from last January. Everyone talks about we have to do something about Social Security and Medicare, and we do. That's the Vice President of the United States. Here are the two co-chairs of the President's Debt Commission, Erskine Bowles and Alan Simpson, in a recent op-ed in Politico, quote, "A credible plan must address the growth of entitlement spending." Here's the President himself, about a month after he took office. "To preserve our long-term fiscal health, we must address the growing costs in Medicare and Social Security." That's the President of the United States. As for me, I've been clear on this same point in public and private from the moment I stepped out of a meeting with the President and other members of Congress at the White House on May the 12th. So it's not exactly a groundbreaking observation that if these discussions are to mean anything at all, they have to involve entitlement reform, since no one believes we can actually get at our fiscal problems without it. This is what serious people expect and are hoping for out of these talks. The moment requires, as I've said for weeks, three things: real cuts in spending over the short term, that is, over the next 2 years, not more spending increases or freezes. Second, real cuts over the medium term, that is, over the next 10 years, with enforceable caps on spending. And third, meaningful reforms to entitlements, which are the major drivers of our debt. That's the definition of a significant package. Now, some Democrats are insisting that they'll only agree to cuts if Republicans agree to raise revenue. That's Washington speak for tax hikes, and it's absurd. First of all, is there anyone outside of Washington, D.C. who really thinks that with 14 million people looking for work in this country, the solution is to raise taxes? Anyone seriously think that's a good idea? The last thing you want to do in the middle of a jobs crisis is raise taxes. Even the President said as much. It's just common sense. You remember the President signed the extension of current tax rates back in December with a similar argument. But even if we weren't in the middle of a jobs crisis, it would be foolish and completely dishonest. We're in the middle of a debt crisis right now because we spend too much. The solution is to spend less. How do we know this? Well, for 30 years, beginning in 1971, federal spending as a percentage of the economy has averaged 20.8%. That's federal spending as a percentage of the economy. But after 2 years of out-of-control spending by the President and his Democratic allies in Congress, government spending is now projected to rise a full 4 percentage points above the historic norm. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but 4% of a $14 trillion economy is an enormous amount of money. Just as the economy sank, Democrats increased government spending by hundreds of billions of dollars. And now they want to make it permanent. That's the reason we've got a deficit like we do. Government spending has gone up, and a bad economy has caused revenue to go down. That's the reason the debt has gone up 35% since the President took office. And now Democrats want to use the bad economy as an excuse to lock their spending levels in place. They want to use it as an excuse to raise taxes, which would only make the economy worse, cause us to lose even more jobs, and make it even harder to create new jobs. So let's be clear about what's going on here. Right now, Washington is borrowing $4 billion every day above what it collects in taxes. And Democrats don't seem to want to admit we have a spending problem. We've got a national debt the size of our entire economy. A national debt the size of our entire economy. And Democrats are wondering whether they want to do anything about the biggest drivers of the debt. Look, Democrats can continue to argue among themselves about whether to step up and address this crisis they've helped create, but they can't argue about what's causing it or what's needed to address it. Republicans have been crystal clear about where we stand, and Democrats have also been crystal clear about what's needed for these talks to be a success. It is my hope that they consider their own past statements on entitlement reform as we approach the end of these talks. The path to success is clear. let's not let this opportunity to do something significant go to waste. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half.
Mr. President.
The senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I rise to join the senator from Massachusetts, who will shortly introduce the product of many hours of bipartisan cooperation and negotiation, an authorization for the limited use of military force in Libya. The resolution, as will be introduced by my colleague from Massachusetts, will be as I mentioned, it would authorize the President to employ the U.S. Armed Forces to advance U.S. national security interests in Libya as part of the international coalition that is enforcing UN Security Council resolutions in Libya. It would limit this authority to 1 year, which is more than enough time to finish the job. And it makes clear that the Senate agrees with the President that there is no need and no desire to commit U.S. conventional ground forces in Libya. I will be the first to admit that this authorization is not perfect and will not make everyone happy. It does not fully make me happy. I would have preferred that this authorization make clear that our military mission includes the President's stated policy objective of forcing Gaddafi to leave power. I would have preferred that it urged the President to commit more U.S. strike aircraft to the mission in Libya so as to help bring this conflict to a close as soon as possible. And I would have preferred that it call on the President to recognize the Transitional National Council as the legitimate voice of the Libyan people so as to free up Gaddafi's frozen assets for the Transitional National Council to use on behalf of the Libyan people. I've called on the administration to do all of these things for some time, and I do so now again. That said, this authorization has been a bipartisan effort. My Republican colleagues and I have had to make compromises, just as the senator from Massachusetts and his Democratic colleagues have had to do. The end result, I believe, is an authorization that deserves the support of my colleagues in the Senate on both sides of the aisle, and I am confident they will support it. Now, I know the administration has made it clear that it believes it does not need a congressional authorization such as this because it is their view that U.S. military operations in Libya do not rise to the level of hostility. I believe this assertion will strike most of my colleagues and the Americans they represent as a confusing breach of common sense. And it seems to be undercut by the very report that the administration sent to Congress, which makes clear that U.S. armed forces have been and presumably will continue to fly limited strike missions to suppress enemy air defenses, to operate armed Predator drones that are attacking Gaddafi's forces in an effort to protect Libyan civilians, and to provide the overwhelming support for NATO operations, from intelligence to aerial refueling. Indeed, we read in today's New York Times that since the April 7th date that the administration claims to have ceased hostilities in Libya, U.S. warplanes have struck at Libyan air defenses on 60 occasions and fired about 30 missiles from unmanned drones. Mr. President, I ask inclusion at this time in the record the article of today's New York Times entitled, "Scores of U.S. Strikes in Libya Followed Handoff to NATO."
Without objection.
I certainly agree that actions like these do not amount to a full-fledged state of war, and I would certainly grant that I am no legal scholar. But I find it hard to swallow that U.S. armed forces dropping bombs and killing enemy personnel in a foreign country does not amount to a state of hostilities. What's worse This is just the latest way in which the administration has mishandled its responsibilities with regard to Congress. The President could have asked Congress to authorize our intervention in Libya months ago, and I believe it could have received a strong, though certainly not unanimous, show of support. The administration's disregard for the elected representatives of the American people on this matter has been troubling and counterproductive. And the unfortunate result of this failure of leadership is plain to see in the full-scale revolt against the administration's Libya policy that is occurring in the House of Representatives. As I speak now, our colleagues in the House are preparing a measure that would cut off all funding for U.S. military operations in Libya, and they plan to vote on it in the coming days. I know that many were opposed to this mission from the beginning, and I respect their convictions. I myself have disagreed and disagreed strongly at times with aspects of the administration's policy in Libya. But at the end of the day, I believe the President did the right thing by intervening to stop a looming humanitarian disaster in Libya. Amid all of our arguments over prudence, legality, and constitutionality of the administration's policy in Libya, we cannot forget the main point. In the midst of the most groundbreaking geopolitical event in 2 decades, as peaceful protests for democracy were sweeping the Middle East, with Gaddafi's forces ready to strike at the gates of Benghazi, and with Arabs and Muslims in Libya and across the region pleading for the U.S. military to stop the bloodshed, the United States and our allies took action and prevented the massacre that Gaddafi had promised to commit in a city of 700,000 people. And by doing so, we began creating conditions that are increasing the pressure on Gaddafi to give up power. Yes, the progress towards this goal has been slower than many had hoped, and the administration is doing less to achieve it than I and others would like. But the bottom line is this: we are succeeding. Gaddafi is weakening. His military leaders and closest associates are abandoning him. NATO is increasing the tempo of its operations and degrading Gaddafi's military capabilities and command and control. The Transitional National Council is gaining international recognition and support and performing more effectively. And though their progress is uneven, opposition forces in Libya are making strategic gains on the ground. We are all entitled to our opinions about Libya policy, but here are the facts. Gaddafi is going to fall. It's just a matter of time. So I would ask my colleagues, is this the time for Congress to turn against this policy? Is this the time to ride to the rescue of a failing tyrant when the writing is on the wall that he will collapse? Is this the time for Congress to declare to the world, to Gaddafi and his inner circle, to all of the Libyans who are sacrificing to force Gaddafi from power, and to our NATO allies who are carrying a far heavier burden in this military operation than we are, is this the time for America to tell all of these different audiences that our heart is not in this, that we have neither the will nor the capability to see this mission through, that we will abandon our closest friends and allies on a whim? These are the questions that every member of Congress needs to think about long and hard, but especially my Republican colleagues. Many of us remember well the way that some of our friends on the other side of the aisle savaged President Bush over the Iraq War, how they sought to do everything in their power to tie his hands and pull America out of that conflict. We were right to condemn this behavior then, and we would be wrong to practice it now ourselves, simply because a leader of the opposite party occupies the White House. Someday, I hope soon, a Republican will again occupy the White House, and that president may need to commit U.S. armed forces to hostilities. So if my Republican colleagues are indifferent to how their actions would affect this president, I would urge them to think seriously about how a vote to cut off funding for this military operation could come back to haunt a future president when the shoe is on the other foot. The House of Representatives will have its say on our involvement in Libya this week. The Senate has been silent for too long. It's time for the Senate to speak. And when that time comes, I believe we will find a strong bipartisan majority that is in favor of authorizing our current military operations in Libya and seeing this mission through to success. That is the message that Gaddafi needs to hear. It is a message that Gaddafi's opponents fighting to liberate their nation need to hear. And it is a message that America's friends and allies need to hear. So let's debate this authorization, but then let's vote on it as soon as possible. Mr. President, I want to thank my colleague from Massachusetts for his hard work on this resolution. I understand he'll be introducing it immediately, and Mr. President, I hope that the Majority Leader of the Senate will schedule a debate and vote on this resolution as soon as possible. It is long overdue. Mr. President, I yield.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
President.
Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President,
The Senate's in a quorum.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the proceedings of the quorum call be dismissed.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, I see another colleague who's waiting for time. I would like to proceed for such time as I ask unanimous consent. I'd be able to proceed for such time as I might use, but it won't be much over the 10.
Without objection.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, I want to thank the Senator from Arizona for his, I think, important and courageous comments that run counter to the political currents of the day, some of which have been expressed in the other body and elsewhere. And I thank him for thinking about the strategic interests of the country ahead of some of the political interests with respect to the next election. There are many occasions where this body has behaved very differently when a president, either Republican or Democrat, has engaged American forces in one way or another without the authorization within that 60-day or even outside of the 60-day parameters of the War Powers Act. The fact is that we had a number of military actions: Panama, Libya in 1986, Grenada 1983, Iran 1980, Haiti 1993, Persian Gulf 1987-88, Lebanon 1982, and then subsequently Kosovo 1999, Bosnia 1992, Somalia 1992, which didn't have this fight about authorization. And in fact, only Iraq in 2003, Afghanistan in 2001, and Iraq in 1990 were authorized prior to our engagement. The fact is that 4 of those that I mentioned ended before the 60 days had expired, but the others didn't. Bosnia, Kosovo, and Somalia all went beyond the 60 days, and the issue was never raised. So I think it's important for us to sort of put this in a context, if you will, and to measure the realities of the choices that we face with respect to Libya today. We will shortly, this morning, a little later, be introducing this resolution. It is a bipartisan resolution, Democrats and Republicans joining together to put in a very limited authorization with respect to our engagement in a support role. Not any direct engagement, but a support role only. And it is limited to that support role. Now, Mr. President, I am particularly familiar with the debate and with the War Powers Act itself over these years because that was a debate that took place specifically in response to the war that Senator McCain and I were both part of, the Vietnam War. The War Powers Act was a direct reaction to that war, which was at that time the longest war in our history until now, Afghanistan. 10 years in duration, over 58,000 Americans lost their lives, and it spanned several administrations, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. And the fact is that as a result of that war, in which we never declared war, the Congress wanted to assert its appropriate prerogatives with respect to the declaration of war and the engagement of American forces. And so the War Powers Act was passed. The War Powers Act very specifically created this dynamic where the Congress had 60 days to act. The President could deploy troops for a period of 60 days without their action. And if they hadn't acted, the inaction itself would require a president to then withdraw troops. So it didn't actually require the Congress to act, but it created this 60-day period. The fact is that any member of Congress during those 60 days could bring a resolution to the floor denying the president the right to go forward. Nobody did that in the past 60 days, I'm glad to say, and we're now beyond those 60 days. It is not without precedent, incidentally, that we have authorized inaction much later. In fact, I think one action was specifically authorized about a year. That was the action in Lebanon. About a year after they had landed, it was authorized. So we're within days of that in terms of this discussion. But let me read specifically what the War Powers Act said. It said, in the absence of a declaration of war, in any case in which the United States Armed Forces are introduced into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances. I think the operative words, the critical words here are United States Armed Forces are introduced into hostilities. Now, you can argue, as people are, and there's an article in the Washington Post today, there are other articles, people saying, well, of course we're in hostilities, because hostilities are taking place and, you know, bombs are being dropped. But that's not, in my judgment, even though I support the War Powers Act, I think, and President Obama, incidentally, has supported it here, which is unique from other presidents. But the fact is that just because hostilities are taking place and we are supporting people engaged in those hostilities does not mean that we are ourselves, in fact, introducing troops into hostilities. No American is being shot at. No American troop is on the ground or contemplated being put on the ground. So the mere fact that others are engaged in hostilities and we are supporting them, I don't believe automatically triggers what was contemplated in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Now, that's not the principal argument, frankly, that we need to be having here. What we really need to be doing is looking at the bigger picture. I don't think any country, the United States, the UN, or any nation, ought to be drawn lightly into any kind of military intervention. I've always argued that here. But there, in my judgment, there were powerful reasons for why the United States should have joined in establishing a no-fly zone over Libya and forcing Gaddafi to keep his most potent weapons out of the fight. And if you slice through the fog of misinformation and you weigh the risks and the benefits here alongside our values and our interests, which are always at stake, I think the justification for the President's involvement, for our country's involvement, and for our supporting it are compelling, and I think they're clear. What is happening in the Middle East right now, Mr. President, could be the single most important geostrategic shift since the fall of the Berlin Wall. It has profound implications for United States expenditures, for United States military engagement in other parts of the region. It has significant impact on the threats that we will face, on the potential strategic risks for our country, and for our interests in terms of that region. Absent United Nations NATO resolve, the promise that the pro-democracy movement holds for transforming the Arab world, the whole Arab world, and all that that could mean to the United States in terms of hopes for peace between Israel and Palestine, hopes for a different set of relationships, hopes for restraining Wahhabism, hopes for diminishing the levels of religious extremism, hopes for reducing the amount of terrorism. All of those things are contained in this awakening, in this transformation that people are trying to achieve. An effort which I believe and others believe would have been crushed if the hopes of the pro-democracy movement were simply ignored and we turned our backs on them. I can't imagine. I mean, just think about the consequences. Colonel Gaddafi says, I'm going to show no mercy. I'm going to go and we're going to kill those dogs who have risen up and expressed their desire to have fundamental freedoms and rights. And he's going to go into Benghazi and he's going to annihilate anybody who's in opposition to him. We already saw him pulling people out of hospital beds. We already saw him attacking women, rape as a tool of war, dishonoring people in the Muslim world as a consequence for life. We saw what he was doing. Are we really serious that in the wake of the Gulf states, in an unprecedented request saying to us, we want your help, in the wake of the Arab League, in an unprecedented request, asking for U.S. and other Western engagement in their part of the world to stand up for these rights, we would simply say, too bad, so sad, go about your business, we got better things to do. The consequences would have been extraordinary. Remember, President Clinton said his greatest regret of his presidency was that he didn't engage in Rwanda and prevent, which we could have done at very low cost, prevent what happened in the genocide in Rwanda. That's his greatest regret. And how many senators have gone to Israel or gone somewhere else in the world where we say to people with respect to the Holocaust, never again? Never again. Do the words only apply to one group of people? Or do the words have meaning in terms of genocide? In terms of wanton killing of innocent people at the hands of a dictator? So what is the cost to us of this great effort? I believe that other dictators would have seen the failure to challenge Gaddafi as a complete license to act with impunity against their people in any other place. The vast majority of the protesters in these countries are simply crying out for the opportunity to live a decent life, get a job, provide for a family, have opportunities, and have rights. Abandoning them, I think, would have betrayed not only the people seeking democratic freedoms, but it would have abandoned the core values of our country. And I can hear now, I can hear it, some of the same people now who are complaining about the president being involved would have been the first people at the barricade complaining about why the United States didn't stand up for our values and how feckless the president was that he wasn't willing to stop a dictator from coming at these innocent people. You can hear it. Everybody in the country knows that's exactly where we'd be. Now, why there and not in Syria? Legitimate question. There are different interests and different capacities. The reality is that the Gulf states asked us to come in. The Arab League asked us to come in. And we knew who we were dealing with respect to the Council and the players. And there are a whole set of uncertainties with respect to Syria, even today, that distinguish it, both in terms of what we can assert and what we can achieve. And sometimes, both in foreign policy and in domestic policy, you're limited to what you can achieve and to what is doable in a certain situation. I believe that if we had simply turned our backs, as some people are now arguing we ought to do now, which would be the most reckless thing I've ever heard in my life, at a moment where people are actually achieving the goals, where the pressures are mounting, where Gaddafi is less able to maneuver, where his forces have been reduced, where many people in our intelligence community and in the NATO intelligence community are saying there's progress being made and the vice is tightening, we would suddenly just pull a rug out from under that. That's extraordinary to me. Snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. I believe, you know, I can't tell you when it might happen, Mr. President, but I'm absolutely confident it's going to happen. Gaddafi's finished. Ask the people in the country. Even his own supporters are reacting out of fear. And the truth is that the vice is tightening because every day that goes by, the opposition gets stronger. Every day that goes by, he has less ability to manage the affairs of the country itself. I think that if we simply send a message that the House of Representatives is contemplating today, it would be a moment of infamy, frankly, with respect to the House and with respect to our interests, because it would reinforce the all-too-common misperception on the Arab street that America says one thing and does another. We're already spending billions of dollars in the fight against extremism in many parts of the world. We didn't choose this fight. Everybody knows that, Mr. President. It was forced on us, starting with 9/11. And to fail to see the opportunity of affirming the courageous demand of millions of disenfranchised young people who had been the greatest recruits for al-Qaeda, for the extremism, for any of the extremist groups, to not affirm their quest now to try to push back against repression and oppression and to try to open up a set of opportunities for themselves, for jobs, for respect, for democracy. I think to turn our backs on that would be ignorant, irresponsible, and short-sighted and dangerous for our country. It would ignore our real national security interests, and it would help extend the narrative of resentment towards the United States and much of the West that is rooted in colonialism and furthered by our own invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Remember, Mr. President, the pleas for help didn't just come from the Libyan rebels. And this isn't something that we just cooked up here at home with some desire to go get engaged somewhere. It came from the Arab League, which has never before asked for this kind of assistance. It came from the Gulf states, who have never before said to the West, we need your help to come intervene. Even at the hand of their own leader, it seems to me that if we had silently accepted the deaths of Muslims, we would have set back our relations for decades. Instead, by responding and giving the popular uprising a chance to take power, I think the United States and our allies sent a message of solidarity with the aspirations of people everywhere. And I believe that will be remembered for generations. The particular nature of the madman who was vowing to show no mercy to his own people, to his own fellow Muslims, the particular nature of this man who was going to go after the dogs who dared to challenge him, and his role in the past, I believe, mandated that we respond, and we responded in a stunningly limited way. I do think our colleagues from New Jersey and New York and other states in New England need to reflect on the fact, and they don't really need a reminder, I suspect, that Gaddafi is the man who was behind the bombing of Pan Am 103, claiming the lives of 189 Americans. And the intervention in Libya, in my judgment, sends a critical signal to other leaders in the region that they can't automatically assume that they can simply resort to large-scale violence to put down legitimate demands to reform without any consequences. I think UN resolve in Libya can have an impact on future calculations. And indeed, I think the leaders of Iran need to pay close attention to the resolve that is exhibited by the international community. And I think we need to think about that resolve in the context of our interests in Iran. Now, Mr. President, the resolution that we will submit, Senator McCain and myself and other senators, is absolutely not a blank check for the President, not at all. It is a resolution that authorizes limited use of American forces in a supporting role. I want to emphasize that. There's only an authorization for a supporting role. It says specifically that the Senate does not support the use of ground troops in Libya. And the President has stated that that is his policy, but we adopt that policy in this resolution. It authorizes the limited use of American forces for a limited duration, and it would expire 1 year from the time of authorization. This resolution envisions action consistent with the letter that the President sent to congressional leaders on May 20th, in which he specified that the U.S. participation in Libya has consisted of non-kinetic support of the NATO-led operation, including intelligence, logistical support, and search and rescue missions. I'll be wrapped. Mr. President, I think I asked for such time as I would use, but I'll try and tighten it up here. So, Mr. President, the administration informed Congress last week it doesn't consider the use of U.S. forces to rise to the level of hostilities, and I've already discussed that. I think there is an important constitutional question here, but it's not a new question. The truth is that presidents, Democrat and Republican, have undertaken limited military action. I mentioned each of those instances. I think this debate is healthy, but the words we use about it has consequences. They send a message. And I think none of us should send any message to Colonel Gaddafi lightly. The last message that any United States senator wants to send, in my judgment, is that all he has to do is wait us out. All he has to do is wait for the Congress, even as the progress is being made, the vice is tightening, because we're divided at home. I think passage of this resolution would be an important step in showing that the country and the rest of the world particularly showing to Muammar Gaddafi that the Congress of the United States and the President of the United States are committed to this critical endeavor. And I firmly believe the country is on the strongest footing when the President and the Congress speak with one voice on foreign policy matters. So I hope our colleagues will support this resolution. For 60 years, Mr. President, we've been working to build a cohesive and consistent alliance with our partners in NATO. Many times, our military and political leaders have complained that our European allies have not carried their share of the burden, that Americans have paid too high a price in blood and treasure that we've led while others followed. Earlier this month, Secretary Gates warned the NATO alliance is at risk because of European penny-pinching and distaste for frontline combat. And he said the United States was not going to carry the alliance as a charity case. Well, Mr. President, here's the alliance leading. Here's the alliance doing what we've wanted them to do for years. And here, all of a sudden, are members of Congress suggesting that it's okay to pull the rug out from under that alliance. That would, I think, really toll the bell for NATO. And I think we need to see the realities of the strategic interests that are on the table here and proceed forward. Will we stand up for our values and our interests at the same time? Will we support the legitimate aspirations of the Libyan people? And I think, Mr. President, our own security ultimately will be strengthened immeasurably if we can assist them to transition to a democracy. The cost now will be far, far less than the cost in the future if we lose our resolve now. Mr. President, I thank my colleague for his generous allowance of the extra time. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The senator from Nebraska.
Mr. President, over a year ago now, the President signed into law health care legislation that we are finding is certainly long on promises but short on sound policy. Unfortunately, the legislation did not follow a transparent or a thorough process. Instead, it was hastily rushed through on a premise that has now become famous. As said by Speaker Pelosi, we have to pass it to see what's in it. Now, almost daily, newspapers, constituent mail, and independent reports continue to reveal that the law's promises are not reality. Recently, the Columbus Dispatch told the story of a family with a pre-existing condition. 2 years ago, their struggles to find health insurance coverage outraged this administration. In fact, their hardship was specifically used as an example of why we needed to get the health care system reformed. Well, party affiliation did not define how we felt about this family. We all empathized and sympathized with their struggles and recognized the need for basic health insurance reforms. But unfortunately, we did not harness that common ground to develop sound policy that addresses the very real problems within the health care system. Instead, a bitterly partisan bill was shoved through Congress, and now we're stuck with its consequences. So what are the consequences for the family who struggled to get insurance? The article reports that their annual premium has increased a whopping $12,000. Clearly, one result of the law is soaring premiums. President Obama promised no fewer than 20 times he would cut premiums by $2,500 for the average family by the end of his term. But unfortunately, this is not an isolated story. This broken promise is evident in homes all across this great nation. Mail from frustrated Nebraskans continues to flood my office. They question how a health care law that costs so much, yet still allows skyrocketing premiums, could have ever passed. A single mother from Bellevue, Nebraska, recently found out that her family's health care premium increased by $700 per year. Her insurance provider explained that it was due to the mandates of the new health care law. And she pleaded with me, please stand up on behalf of single moms like me. We do all we can to hold our world together, to give up time with our children, to work 2 jobs, and now this. How am I supposed to maintain health insurance for my family, she writes. Well, I wish I could tell constituents that their premiums won't go up as the President promised. I wished I could tell them that the new health care law addressed the rising costs of health care, as the President promised it would. Instead, these stories reflect what the experts predicted would happen if the law passed. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimated that individual health insurance premiums would increase by an average of $2,100 per family due solely to the new mandates included in the law. That puts the gap between candidate Obama's promise and President Obama's health care law at an alarming $4,600 per family. The administration's own Medicare actuary expects health care costs to increase $311 billion over the next decade under the new law. In fact, the actuary testified that the President's promise that the health care law would lower costs was, quote, false, more so than true, unquote. Now, some may say, Mike, just wait until the law is fully implemented. That's when the promises will be fulfilled. But I continue to get reports on my desk forecasting the negative consequences of this irresponsible and short-sighted piece of legislation. For example, one of the law's major flaws is that half of its new health insurance coverage is achieved by locking millions of people into an already broken Medicaid system. Yet, the New England Journal of Medicine recently released a study showing those on Medicaid struggle to find doctors to treat them. The medical journal's research revealed that 66% of individuals who mentioned Medicaid's Children's Health Insurance Program when called to schedule a medical appointment were denied an appointment for their child. That's compared to only 11% who said, I have private insurance. That's right. Those on Medicaid's CHIP program were 6 times more likely to be denied an appointment. And when Medicaid was accepted, the children had to wait on average 22 days longer than those with private insurance. Researchers blame low Medicaid payments, delays in paying, bureaucratic red tape for all of these problems. As a former governor, I can tell you that these problems have long plagued the Medicaid program. Yet in 2014, the President's new law dramatically expands Medicaid, dumping 24 million more Americans onto this very broken system. So how can the President promise guaranteed coverage for these millions of Americans when this study shows the majority of our most vulnerable population are denied treatment under the Medicaid system? The bottom line is, if you can't receive care, if you can't find a doctor to provide it, you don't have coverage. The logic simply doesn't match the promises. Another recent study by a consulting group, McKinsey & Company, calls another one of the President's guarantees into question. Their study analyzed the impact of the health care law on employer-sponsored benefits. Prior to the health care law, America's employers were the backbone of our nation's health care system. They provided 165 million Americans with coverage. The McKinsey study found that 30% of employers will definitely or probably stop offering their employees health insurance after 2014. During the health care debate, supporters of the law insisted that the law builds on the principle of employer-sponsored coverage. The President even repeatedly promised if you like your plan, you can keep it. Again, an empty promise. According to the study and others that came before it, employees will be stripped of their plans that they like and dumped onto the new law's health care exchanges. Now, I realize there's disagreement surrounding the study, so let's just appeal to common logic. The more you know about the law, the more you conclude it just doesn't make sense for employers to offer a health care plan. Beginning in 2014, the health care law mandates that employers with 50 workers offer health insurance coverage or pay a penalty of $2,000 per worker. And with this mandate comes a whole slew of other requirements. Well, suddenly, dropping coverage and paying the penalty becomes an economic necessity, and it's cheaper. During the health care debate, I spoke on the Senate floor about this issue. I and many others warned that the proposed penalties had a perverse incentive. When you do the math, and I said back then, there is no penalty at all compared to the cost of private insurance. In fact, it's a business decision. If you're worried about the bottom line, you save money by paying the premium or paying the penalty. That's how the law encourages employers to dump their employees. A Deloitte consultant told the Associated Press, and I'm quoting, I don't know if the intent was to find an exit strategy for providing benefits, but the bill as written provides the mechanism. John Deere has responded by saying business will look into, quote, just paying the fine, unquote. Not surprisingly, employers are doing the math. AT&T reported that its $2.4 billion cost of coverage would drop to $600 million if they just paid the penalties. Estimates reveal Caterpillar could save 70% on health care costs by eliminating coverage and paying the penalties, and the list goes on and on. Prior to its passage, the Congressional Budget Office predicted 7% of employers would drop their coverage. Now studies in Business Logic are challenging that estimate. This may mean that the CBO's projected cost of health care is too low. That's right, the $2.6 trillion cost estimate is too low, if you can imagine that. The President promised the bill would lift the burden off the middle class. It hasn't. Unfortunately, time is confirming what we predicted all along. The case for repeal of the health care law is stronger day by day. I'll do everything I can to overturn these negative consequences. I believe Americans deserve better. One thing they deserve, that promises made be promises kept. Madam President, I yield the floor.